although the focus on the so-called vaccines is understandable because the level of intrusion is so great, that these are not the only mandates. And I believe, if I'm correct, your story actually initially unfolded around other mandates. Is that right?
Yes. And I think if you actually look at the timeline of, COVID and what's transpired since then, you can see that all of this was, in my opinion, intentionally conducted to demoralize people. Specifically in the military, we were told that we had to mask up. Even when the civilian population, was told they didn't have to wear masks anymore, we were told we have to mask up no matter what. And I worked in a unit with, we did shift work, and it was very mentally tough situations. It was a PED unit, so processing, exploitation, dissemination. You're looking at things that, most people will never see in their life. And these are, young airmen out of high school, so 18 to 25-year-olds, witnessing really traumatic things, and add on the fact that, they were put in forced isolation, forced quarantine, forced to submit to testing if they wanted to get seen at a medical clinic. And then they were told to mask up all the time. In fact, I knew flight commanders who would yell at airmen if they even put their mask down to eat or to breathe. I was not one of those commanders, and I very rarely wore my mask, especially if I was, by myself. And the only time I wore it was in my job. I didn't wear it outside of the military base. But you started to see this breakdown, this mental breakdown from these young airmen, many of whom experienced suicidal ideation. Just in the span of 5 months, I had 4 to 5 young airmen who had experienced suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts. And when I brought this up to my chain of command and said, the rate of suicides is much higher than the rate of healthy military members dying from COVID, they completely ignored what I had to say, or some of them said, I know, but we have to do this. Basically, I know, but we have to follow these orders, no matter the science behind it. So then after this was the COVID mandates. And at this point, I think a lot of people in the military gave in to these mandates because they saw that nobody was sticking up for them with the mask mandates. And they were completely demoralized. And even today, military installations are forcing the unvaccinated to submit to weekly testing with an EUA product because they're unvaccinated, even if they have no symptoms.
With an EUA product that frankly doesn't work.
Right.
So to me, ineptitude doesn't quite get you there. This is just punishment. This is harassment of people who have shown a willingness to refuse an immoral order.
Right. And instead of, backing off and saying we were wrong, we've done evaluation, now the science is showing us, what we didn't know before, they're doubling down. And I think that's the most concerning for me specifically. And I think for a lot of military officers and military senior NCOs, what was the most concerning was when you saw the civilian population being mandated to get a vaccine. In the military, it's expected of us. We are expected to get, certain vaccines, but there's always been exceptions, right? There's always been medical exceptions. There's always been religious accommodation exceptions. But when you see the civilian population being told that in order to keep your job, you have to get a vaccine, for me, that was kind of the moment of, what am I doing? The role of, I think, the military is to protect constitutional rights of Americans. And when we couldn't even protect Americans' constitutional rights against our own government, that was kind of my what is going on moment.
Yeah, there are a number of things in there that I think we need to focus on. One of them is, okay, there are some vaccines that are required. There are reasons for that. In this case, you're dealing with something so new that it has not been FDA approved. So this is a place where informed consent is essential. It is obviously absent. And worse, it is not as if there isn't an approved version, but somehow it's not available to anybody. Am I correct? The military does not have the availability of the FDA approved version of this vaccine?
You are absolutely correct. And they have, tried to say that they have the FDA approved version, but some amazing whistleblowers have actually exposed that this FDA version that the DoD said that they had was not produced at an FDA approved facility. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, and so previously talking about what's the objective here, I think the objective is to comply with government mandates because all other remedies have been completely ignored. Hydroxychloroquine is a remedy that works. And in the military, it's actually something that's prescribed if you deploy to African countries. But for some reason, the military would not give you hydroxychloroquine as a remedy for COVID. And so, you have to kind of think like, what is the objective here? Is it to force vaccinate everybody, or is it government compliance? And I think that there's been a couple of different mandates that the objective is to comply with what the government is telling you.
Right. Now, this worries me tremendously because the argument I've made is if you wanted to create a force that would accept immoral orders, this would be how you would do it. You would deliver some orders that were completely arbitrary and absurd, and then you would see who showed signs of resistance. You would strong arm them and coerce them, and you would see who would knuckle under. And then anybody who, in the face of that, stood strong, you'd throw them out, right? That's basically the rapid plan to making a compliant force that doesn't have any notion of what was learned at Nuremberg. So that this alarms me. It does have the sense of some deadly game of Simon Says, and the result of that is going to be, oh my God, our military force is now compliant, irrespective of what it is that it's being told to do. I don't want to live in a country where that's true, because I know what happens in countries where that's true. So, maybe
now, I'll tell you, Bret,
it's not that, but we have to be worried. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to live in that country either, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Jordan alluded to this earlier, but we have a spiritual crisis going on in the military, and this is just one part of it. When I say spiritual, a lot of people don't know what that means. I'm just using the holistic health and fitness term for spiritual. It's one of the 5 domains of readiness. It's just purpose. What's your purpose? I can tell you that my professional purpose, I have a lot of personal things that are, my purpose, like taking care of my family. But my professional purpose is to support and defend the Constitution. It's very straightforward. And so if I see an order and a process where there's a constitutional process and religious accommodation, I see that process not being respected, the number one way that I can fulfill that purpose is by going through that process and trying to hold people accountable and taking that process seriously. And what you saw with this mandate, specifically with religious accommodations, is widespread attempts to prevent people from submitting religious accommodations. I can tell you that personally, when I talk to chaplains, they would say, oh, that doesn't sound like a religious belief. And then they would say, oh, just so you know, there haven't been any that have been approved. I got told that by at least a half a dozen individuals, those exact words. Hey, just so you know, none have been approved. And that was during a time when none had really been denied either. And, I knew the background of the process from, following Robert Barnes, who's, a great attorney that knows a lot about constitutional law. So I had that benefit. But what about junior privates that had no idea? When they publish a document that goes through a list of faiths, like, hey, this is what this one, the Pope says. This is what this person that's a Baptist says. And they're saying, hey, you should be able to get the shot. That's coercion. That's trying to insinuate that somebody that comes from those faiths doesn't have a legitimate claim. And I will tell you, I am an atheist, and I have a sincerely held belief as determined by a chaplain. And so if you understand what constitutes a religious belief under the law, then you can understand that almost everybody that denied this injection had a legitimate claim. And we actually have a process in the Army for uncovering that. So not getting this injection when it ends your career and exposes you to a lot of adverse action and unpleasant interpersonal interactions, why would you make a sacrifice like that? Just because you don't want to? Well, in the Army, we have something called master resiliency training. And there's a bunch of, divisions of competencies. And one of those competencies is self-awareness. Now, this is based on positive psychology research out of the University of Pennsylvania. It's an excellent program. And if people had just used the tools that we had and gone, okay, let's think about this. There's a skill called detect icebergs. So, hey, you have a soldier, they're declining the vaccine. Instead of just saying they're a dirtbag and assassinating their character, why not try and figure out why? Maybe they can't articulate exactly why, but it's your duty as a leader, given that we're talking about constitutional rights here, your First Amendment rights, to dig in and find out exactly why. And if people had just done this and followed the process, it wouldn't have had nearly the negative impact that it had, because there would have been this way for people that had a sincere objection to find out, hey, does this constitute a religious belief or not? There's ways to investigate that. I believe that the service has made a deliberate effort to obfuscate that. And there's evidence of that where, an attorney for the Department of Justice was caught on tape talking about how, people that are declining it because it has aborted fetal stem cells in the testing process, that's going to be a really hard claim to overcome. As if they're strategizing about how they're going to infringe upon people's religious freedoms. And so, that's my big thing that I want people to understand is that by not getting the vaccine or requesting religious accommodation, or getting the vaccine and taking care of soldiers and airmen, whatever branch of service, by taking care of them and trying to, detect those icebergs, see what those beliefs were, to see if they had a belief that would warrant accommodation, I think that we'd be in a really great place. But they didn't do that. And I think that at the highest levels, that lack of attention was encouraged. And the focus, instead of being on the Constitution and religious liberty and First Amendment rights, I think it was exactly like you said. I think it was on compliance. I think that our senior leaders are more concerned about compliance than they are with fulfilling their oaths to support and defend the Constitution, which is a spiritual crisis. Because I think if you wear the uniform, that should be your number one purpose professionally, because that's what your oath says it should be.
Yeah, this has the unmistakable sense, to me at least, of a desire to unhook the normal constitutional protections, right? It's not a question of them failing to meet them. It's a question of them seeing that a sincere religious objection to a mandated treatment is a loophole that they cannot tolerate if they, basically, if you want to have a force that must comply and is devoid of people who would resist, then you can't have loopholes like sincerely held religious beliefs. I would also say I don't describe myself as an atheist. I'm pretty close to it. I believe that the universe is a place in which there is nothing metaphysical going on, but it doesn't matter. I don't think of myself as an atheist. I think of religious beliefs as very important and fundamental to how we got here. But this is more or less beside the point. I studied as a scientist. That's what I am. And I can tell you that people's concerns, their religious concerns about these treatments, even if they cannot phrase it in scientific terms, are valid. There is a violation of a fundamental principle that, I can come close to stating. I can say, look, you've got a virus. It is itself apparently unnatural. You have a essentially miraculous system for fending off pathogens that your ancestors have never encountered before. And it works very well with COVID. It works very well with COVID. And the only exceptions are people who are profoundly compromised by either age or comorbidities or both. The idea that some entity wants to mandate a radical physiological alteration of your system. It wants to hijack your cells and turn them into vaccine factories, something that has never been done before. That it thinks it has the right to tell you that that is not only in your best interest, but it is so essential to your functioning in the military that it can require it of you is preposterous. It's biologically preposterous. You have a system to fight off viruses, even ones you've never seen. It works well with respect to COVID. The mandates are not coherent in light of that fact, in light of the seriousness of the disease and the uncertainties surrounding the treatment. So, okay, those are sentences I can say because I trained to be able to phrase it. But the fact that somebody's objection may come in metaphorical or spiritual terms does not mean it's not valid. Their intuition that, hey, I don't want that thing injected into me, that sounds like a violation of my nature as a human, whether that nature as a human is the result of a creator or the result of evolution or the result of a creator who used evolution, doesn't matter. It's a violation of your humanity. And so I guess the point is those objections are sound. The system that looks at them and says, ooh, we can't really tolerate sound objections now, can we? Because we're going to be ordering people to do all kinds of things that they might object to. And so let's deal with that now. That's a system that is it's gearing up for something, and we can't afford to find out what, frankly.